Nice bright Sunday morning out there. At least it is here in New England. I hope it is wherever you're at. The sun is out shining, blue sky, no clouds. In fact, right after the show, I intend to head out and go on a nice bike ride here. It's an awesome day. Got to take advantage of this while I can because pretty soon Old Man Winter is going to be kicking in on us, and out the window goes my biking hobby for a few more months. But anyway, welcome to Truth Hertz Radio. This is your host, Charles Giuliani. Many of the listeners, I'm sure, are tuning in from some other networks I used to be on. I told them I was moving over to Oracle, so welcome to you guys. Sorry for the mix-up. I actually told everybody the show was going to be from 8 to 10 a.m., but that was the wrong time zone. I forgot to take into consideration I'm in a different time zone, so it's actually 9 to 11 every Sunday. So hopefully everybody got that message when they checked the schedule online. Anyway, for those new listeners tuning in, Truth Hertz, a little play on words, Hertz, as in megahertz, but of course also Truth Hertz. That's my motto. The truth isn't a pleasant thing. It's not something, most of the time anyway, that people want to hear. It does hurt, but it's something we need to hear. And like I always say, I would rather swallow the bitter truth than the sweet lie. The sweet lie goes down nicely. Oh, it's so tasty. But once it hits rock bottom, once it hits the gut, it starts to rot you from within. So I'd rather have the bitter truth, the bitter pill. It doesn't go down so nicely, but when it hits the gut, it's a good feeling. It's going to bring health to you ultimately. Whereas the lie will kill you ultimately, literally and figuratively. So that's what we'll be dealing with on this show, exposing errors, revealing truth, not just regarding politics, by the way, but a whole lot of different subjects. I'll be jumping all over the map. Those who have heard my shows in the past know that I have a whole bunch of interests, and my specialty is lifting the rug up and looking at the lumps under there and finding out how they got there, who put them there, why they're there. And what does it mean to me? So that's really the theme of my show. Anyway, I've got a interesting and important topic that I chose for my opening broadcast. We're going to be talking about the history of the New World Order, but particularly focused on the U.S., because, of course, it's been the United States that the globalists have worked through more than any other country to bring this New World Order about. So we're going to basically go back to the beginning of this country's history and come on up through into the present and see how they hijacked us, what they did to us, how they got us to this position that we're in right now. It's not a pretty picture. It's something that, of course, you're not going to see in the mainstream history books. In fact, it's something that's suppressed in the mainstream history books. So we're going to be taking a look at that. Before I get into that, though, I can see we got a break coming in here, so I'll say that when we get back. I want to go over some announcements, and then we'll get into our discussion, folks. So stick with us. We'll be right back on Truth Hertz Radio. All right, guys. Welcome back to Truth Hertz Radio. Again, this is your host, Charles Giuliani. And we're going to have an interesting discussion here momentarily on the history of the New World Order in the United States, or better yet, how the United States has been used to bring about the New World Order. But before we get into that, I just wanted to mention, for those of you not familiar, I have written a whole series of books, actually written 20. Eventually, I'm going to get them available on Amazon. I've got 9 of them so far, almost halfway there. The editing is murder. Anybody who's ever written a book can attest to that. The biggest burden of writing a book is editing. It's not the research, it's not the writing, it's the editing. Over and over and over. You got to read it and read it and reread it, and then when you're done reading that, rereading it, and you got to read it again. It's very laborious. But anyway, so far I've got 9 of them up on Amazon. I've got one called Piercing the Fog of 9/11, another one called The New World Disorder, basically a history of the New World Order, how we got in this mess. It covers everything from central banking to the fraudulent income tax, the history of the United Nations, how they hijacked our education system, our media, even organized religion. You name it, it's in there. It's fully referenced. Over 500-600 references, I forget now, well over 500 references anyway in the back. All mainstream sources, government sources, so people can't say, oh, you're making this up, you're paranoid. I got another book called An Alternative View of the Distant Past. It's really fascinating. No politics in there. It's just another way of looking at ancient history. Very interesting. And on future broadcasts, I'll be covering some of the topics in there. But if anyone's interested in checking any of these books out, you can just go to Amazon.com, type in my name, Charles Giuliani. Yeah, it is spelled the same way as that pig Rudolph, Giuliani. Thank God, no relation. Not that I know of, anyway. I'm almost afraid to look up my family tree and find out I might be related to the scumbag, so I'm not even going to bother. But it's a pretty rare name, so there could be some connection. I don't know. But, just go to Amazon.com, type in my name. You'll see my books come up. And, if money's an obstacle, I always like to put this out there. Don't hesitate. You can just email me at truthhertzradio@aol.com. Again, spell Hertz, Hertz. Let me know what titles you're interested in, and I can just send them to you as an attachment file. I've done that many times over the years. I don't mind, because my aim isn't to make money. It's simply to get the word out, open people's eyes, what's going on. But anyway, I also wanted to mention briefly here a friend of mine who I met on a previous network a couple of years ago. A great guy. He turned out, I didn't realize when I first started talking to him, and he would call him in one of my old shows, that he's an herbalist. His name is Mike Anthony. Some of the listeners, I'm sure, know who he is. He lives in upstate New York. He's put together some amazing herbal packages, herbal products, and they're extremely affordable, especially when you realize the pharmaceutical scoundrels there, will charge you $100, $200, $300 bucks for a bottle of garbage that, won't even benefit you. It'll benefit them, of course, fill their pockets, but, almost all the pharmaceutical products out there, folks, they don't even deliver. As many of my listeners know, I'm sure, they don't even do what they profess to do. Very often they'll, they not only won't do what they claim they'll do, they won't help you in the area they're supposed to help you in, but they'll make you sick in other areas. If nothing else, they'll rot your kidneys or your liver. Pharmaceuticals are just poison, pure and simple. But herbs do work, and I can attest, especially for a blend he has called Rapid Heal. If you suffered an injury recently, in fact, any kind of bodily trauma, internal, external, you name it, Rapid Heal is the formula for you. You got to check this stuff out. I don't want to take the whole show up on this, but I got to tell you the story real quick. Last year I busted my shoulder. Somebody cut me off. I was on my bike. They pulled in front of me, and I slammed on the brakes, and I managed to avoid hitting the car, but the bike in the process went up in the air. I went up over the handlebars and came slamming down on my left shoulder. Thank God I landed the right way so as not to break my neck or something or crack my skull open. I didn't have a helmet on. I do wear a helmet faithfully all the time now, of course, but even though it wasn't pleasant to bust my shoulder, at least it wasn't anything more serious than that. It could have been. Anyway, to make a long story short, I had to get surgery. They had to go in and reset the bone and take out some fragments that were loose in there. It was kind of nasty. The surgery put me in more pain than the actual injury itself. Within 2 days, I got a package in the mail. I mentioned on my show, that I had busted my shoulder, so Mike Anthony called in. He says, hey, I got something for you. I'm going to send me your address after the show, and I'll mail it to you. Anyway, I get the package. I took 10 capsules. He recommends 6 to 8. I took 10. I wanted to maximize the effect of these things. And you know what? I kid you not. Within about 10 or 15 minutes, the pain absolutely disappeared. I was taking Percocet and something else they gave me for pain. It didn't even work. I felt every bit of that pain. All it did was give me a buzz, And it made me constipated. I was miserable, As soon as I took those herbs, I'm not kidding, folks, the pain absolutely disappeared, and it never returned as long as I kept taking, I took 10 of them every day for the next maybe 5 weeks, and the truth is I didn't even need to take them for 5 weeks. I just wanted to make sure the thing was completely healed. But after only about 2 weeks, I went to the doctor, and he's looking at the x-rays. He says, oh my, I don't understand it. The bone is almost completely healed. You're over a month ahead of where you should be. So not only did it take the pain away, but of course, as the name of the herbal mix implies, it healed me rapidly, rapid heal. Although I told him he should call it pain zapper, because when you're hurting, getting rid of the pain is more important than healing rapidly. But it does both, folks. Rapid heal. He's also got a anti-cancer formula. He's got a daily health maintenance formula. He's got herbal teas. He's got a mix called dragon juice, which is not only good tasting, but it gives you a lot of energy. Anyway, you got to check this guy out. If you're interested, you can give him a call and tell him I sent you from Truth Hertz, 845-231-1094. Again, that's 845-231-1094. Give this guy a call, and you won't be disappointed. I'm telling you, this stuff is amazing. I couldn't believe it. I called him back the same day. I said, you weren't kidding. This stuff absolutely just totally took the pain away. It's like I didn't even break the shoulder. In fact, I got up and jumped in the shower. I didn't think I'd be able to take a shower for, a month. But within 10 or 15 minutes, whatever, after taking those 10 pills, there I was in the shower, painlessly. It's incredible. All right, guys, here's another break. Stick with us. Be right back. All right, folks, welcome back to Truth Hertz Radio. Love those bumper songs there. Sometimes feel like just sitting and listening to them. That's a good tune, Dreamweaver. Unfortunately, the scum that run this country, and indeed the whole world, are dream weavers themselves, although their dreams are nightmares. And they want to pawn off their little nightmares on us. Before I get into our discussion for today, let me mention the call-in numbers. Anybody wants to call in, you get some comments, questions, concerns, gripes, things that you agree with or disagree with. In fact, I prefer people who disagree. I always say, hey, if I'm wrong, prove it. I'd love to be proven wrong. I'd probably sleep better at night, if I could relax knowing that our leaders love us so much and that everything they do is designed to make our lives better. They just happen to screw up consistently all the time, but they have the best intentions. At least it would be nice knowing they had good intentions, even if it never turns out good. So, you don't agree with me, call in and prove me wrong. I dare you to try. The phone number to do that is 512-904-8014. Again, that's 512-904-8014. We also have a toll-free number, although, it does cost money. So if you can avoid that, if it doesn't cost you to call long distance, or if you have a cell phone, use the number I just gave. Otherwise, you can use the toll-free number 866-841-1065. But, give us a call here at Oracle. Love to hear from you anytime during the broadcast. Anyway, with all that said and done, we're almost a half hour into the 2 hours here. I hadn't even started, so let me jump into this because there's a lot of material to cover, a lot of important information. To understand why this country is in the mess that it's in, and has been in the mess that it has been in for a long time now, you could really literally argue that this country has been in a mess from day one, because the scum that run it and have been running it have always had this hidden yet not so hidden agenda to suck us into a tyrannical world system of government. Anybody who's ever read the book, The Secret Destiny of the United States by the late 33rd degree Mason, Manly P. Hall, one of the most preeminent, if not the most preeminent Freemasons of the 20th century, then you know that there has been this goal working behind the scenes from day one on the part of Freemasons and other secret societies, Freemasonry and whatnot. The Skull and Bones, which is really a branch of Freemasonry, It's always been the goal of these twisted occultists to bring about world government using the United States to do it. Not too much progress was made early on in the country's history, but that was for a good reason. They wanted to fool the people. They wanted things to operate the way they were telling them they were operating, for the most part, on the surface anyway, so that they could fool people, put them into a false sense of security, and get them to believe that, yeah, this country is everything it professes to be. It is the greatest place in the world to live. And to a large extent, it is still a great place to live. Unfortunately, though, when you look at what's going on in Washington, it's not going to be that way for much longer, folks, if we don't wake up and fast. It's already not a good place, comparatively speaking, to what it was, 10, 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. 30, 40 years ago, you could subsist on one income. Daddy's income would pay all the bills, pay the mortgage. You could even take a vacation or two a year and still have money left over to have savings, save for the kids' college fund and whatnot. You can't do that today. Today, Mommy and Daddy are both working and can barely make ends meet. In fact, Mommy and Daddy very often have two jobs, if they can find two jobs anymore, or even one job anymore for that matter. A lot of families today, Mommy and Daddy are both laid off and collecting unemployment, which is going to run out in a few more months. It's going to be hell to pay when that hits the fan. But you see what I'm saying? Our lifestyle is dwindling, folks. Our living standards are going down the toilet by design. By design. This is what they want. They want to bring us down to third world status, and indeed the whole world down to third world status. And as was the case in 1929, so shall it be again when they take our economy down. And that's all they need to do. When they take our economy down, it's going to have the ripple effect around the world and literally take down the whole world economy. So they can step forward and say, we need to have a world economy now, a world currency, a world bank. Well, they already got the World Bank, but it's not a fully fledged World Bank yet. They don't have total control over the printing of the world currency. There is no world currency as yet, but that's what they want. They want the World Bank ultimately, or something else like it, to become that world monetary controlling system, just like the Federal Reserve has become our national bank, if you will, controlling the nation's economy centrally. And so that will take us to the beginning of the story, because that's the first thing that the globalists did. It's beginning back in 1791. The country was only, 15 years old at the time, still in its infancy. And, anybody familiar with Adam Weishaupt and his twisted plan to form, a world government through his secret society called the Illuminati, he knew the only way to bring about his twisted aim was through the power of money. If you want to take over a nation without the nation even knowing that you're taking it over, not using, swords and bullets and whatnot, if you want to do it subtly, unperceptibly, the only way to do it is through the power of money. Money makes the world go round, as they say, right? Well, money also can turn the world upside down. And that, of course, was his aim. That's been the aim all along of the globalists, to turn the world upside down. So, anyway, beginning in 1791, the globalist bankers, who had already established the Bank of England, that went back to the 17th century. They'd been wreaking havoc in England, for centuries, a century and a half or so anyway. And now they realized, okay, if we want to get this mechanism of control underway in other countries, we've got to set up central banks in other countries, just like the Bank of England. So they began here in 1791 to do that by creating what was called the First Bank of the United States. Immediately, people like Thomas Jefferson saw this for what it was and began speaking out vehemently against it. Jefferson made many important statements regarding this banking system. It wasn't a fully fledged central bank, but he saw it for what it was. He knew that it was the early stages toward a central bank like what had already existed in England. He knew what it had done to the British economy. He didn't want to see it repeated here. So he fought it vehemently. And sure enough, the charter ran out in 1811 or 1812. But it did get renewed. You know, they tweaked the economy on Wall Street, played with the stock market a little, and of course, we also had the War of 1812. That was all orchestrated, folks, from behind the scenes by the Rothschild dynasty over in England, to get us into debt so that they could create the need for, renewing the charter for the first Bank of the United States. And it worked. 4 years later, we got the second Bank of the United States. Anyway, short break, folks. I'll pick up from there when we get back. Stick with us. All right, guys. Welcome back to Hertz Radio. Again, it's your host, Charles Giuliani. Just a reminder, if anybody wants to call in during the broadcast, you can do so by dialing 512-904-8014. Again, 512-904-8014. Use it sparingly, but there is a toll-free number, 866-841-1065. Okay, let me pick up where we left off before the commercial break. We talked about the first Bank of the United States. Its charter ran out in 1812. And conveniently, that same year, along comes the War of 1812. Obviously, folks, staged by the Rothschild boys over there in England to try to suck us into debt so that they could say, hey, we got just the answer for you. You need a central bank to help you pay off that war debt. And it worked. The charter got renewed for the first Bank of the United States in 1816. Unless you had what was called the Second Bank of the United States. Now, it wasn't a fully fledged central bank, but it was the early stages of what was hoped would become a fully fledged central bank. Interestingly, 4 years after that, or actually 7 years after that, we had the Panic of 1819, designed to crush out, rival banks and make the Second Bank of the United States emerge as a more central banking power in the country. Just like, the Federal Reserve, 1913, and then, 16 years later, we had the crash of 29 and then the ensuing Great Depression, orchestrated by the same banking families that ran that bank. We had the Panic of 1907, which precipitated the creation of the Federal Reserve, 6 years later, crushing out rival banks. These monkeys are so obvious, right in your face. You can't miss it. I mean, look at the debacle that we got September of last year that resulted in the bailout. They stage these phony economic crises so they can rape and pillage the public treasury. Oh, and I love what FDR did on behalf of them on March 9th, 1933, with his Emergency Banking Relief Act. Of course, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's something for later in the broadcast. I hope I have time to get to it. What a scam that was. While the nation is suffering from the crash and the depression, and the banks are walking away holding all the chips, he turns around and steals everybody's gold to hand it over to the very bank that got us in the mess. This bailout we're in, this isn't the first time stuff like this has happened in this country. Good heavens, no. It's been going on from day one, especially since the creation of the Federal Reserve. They create phony crises to justify taking more of what you've got and handing it over to people who are already filthy rich, drowning in wealth. It's so disgusting. But certainly, though this bailout isn't the first, grand theft enterprise orchestrated by the government on behalf of Wall Street, it is the biggest. Absolutely the biggest, not only in this country's history, but in the history of the entire human race that we know of. There's never been a heist on the scale of this one, folks, in all of recorded human history. The estimates are anywhere from 12 to 24 trillion. Some are even higher. The truth is we don't even know anymore. It began at $750 billion, and look what it's up to now. It's incredible. Absolutely incredible. They're probably biting their nails in frustration and wondering, why hasn't it crashed yet? They do want to crash it. And it will crash as long as people continue to sit back and let them get away with these shenanigans. But anyway, we're focusing, of course, this morning on, the United States. But I do need to mention this. All the while, they're pushing for a central bank here in this country during the early, late 18th and early 19th century. Central banks were popping up all over Europe at the same time. France, Germany, Italy, and Greece, and it's interesting. In fact, I have that in my book, The New World Disorder. I have a a list of all these central banks and the years that they started. They were very busy. The Rothschild agents were, working like little busy bees all over the place, creating these central banks. They were popping up all over Europe, all during the 19th century. And as soon as these banks would pop up, the next thing you know, a war would break out over here, over there. And, of course, they were raking in the dough, because as these wars broke out, they were giving loans through these central banks to the various participating countries and walking away with big fat wads of cash. But an even more important piece of the puzzle, it wasn't just the money they were making, but they were creating desperate situations and using them as opportunities to get more control over these nations. They would lose a little more sovereignty each time as the post-war contracts would be drafted up. The bankers always sought to it that more power would be given over to them, leading toward, ultimately, of course, a world government. They would create these alliances, get nations used to cooperating with each other. That's, of course, what happened, at the time of World War I. You had the Triple Alliance, the Triple Entente, sold to the nations as a means of preventing a war, when in reality all they did was ensure a war. Because once one nation inevitably attacked another, and that was coaxed along, of course, the assassination of the Archduke of Austria there, Francis Ferdinand. Inevitably, all the other nations that were involved in the alliance were dragged into the conflict. It ensured a broader war. It wasn't just one country against another now, because all the allied nations were dragged into the conflict. And that's what they wanted. They wanted a world war. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me step back here to 1816, we had the renewing of the charter of the First Bank of the United States. We now had the Second Bank of the United States, and it continued for a time until good old Andrew Jackson stepped onto the scene. Like Thomas Jefferson before him, Andrew Jackson recognized this Second Bank of the United States as an attempt by the European bankers to gain control over the United States economy and thus over the United States itself. Thomas Jefferson was never shot at for his attempts at trying to shut down the First Bank of the United States. They weren't that deeply entrenched at the time. But by the time Jackson came along and the Second Bank of the United States was in full swing, they did have themselves more deeply entrenched in this country. And so they had their little minions make several attempts on Jackson's life. Jackson recognized that those attempts on his life were at the hand of the bankers. In fact, he called Biddle out specifically, who was the president of the Second Bank of the United States, as being responsible for those attempts on his life. He called them a den of thieves, a den of vipers. He said, "I will root you out." He said, "I promise by the eternal God that I will root you out." And he did. In 1836, he got the Second Bank of the United States shut down. He caught a bullet in the head just a year before that as one of the attempts on his life. He did survive it, thank heavens. But he knew what they were up to. He called a spade, and he said, "You are not going to get away with in this country while I'm president, what you've been doing over in Europe." So now look what happens. A very interesting pattern emerges. I call it the 20-year syndrome. From that time on, every 20 years, for the next 60 years, we had a president assassinated who stood up against central banking in this country. I guess they figured 20 years was enough time, wait for the next generation. People's attention will be off of the scoundrels in the central banking world trying to set up their central bank here. They'll forget about it, and then we can make yet another attempt at it. So that's just what happened. Under Lincoln, roughly 20 years later, they're trying to set up another central bank, or at least the early precursors of it. They were trying to get Lincoln to, I said 20 years, roughly 25 years, whatever, close enough. Roughly every 20 years. Look at the pattern. They're trying to get Lincoln to take loans from them and to set up a central bank with which they can pay back, take those loans and pay them back more easily, more conveniently, for the Civil War. Lincoln wasn't buying it. Lincoln once said, "I have two great enemies to contend with. Before me I have the bankers, behind me I have the South, and it's the enemy before me that I consider the most formidable. He considered the bankers to be the greatest threat, not the Confederacy. And so, because he refused, he would not allow his country to go into perpetual debt. He knew that's exactly what would happen, that we would be enslaved ceaselessly into debt, like where we're at right now. He printed greenbacks, United States greenbacks that were not interest-bearing. It was a debt that was easily paid off. We weren't sunk into slavery through usurious, exorbitant interest rates. There was no interest. It worked brilliantly. But, of course, it infuriated the bankers. Lincoln had to go, and so they did. They popped him off, folks. I'll continue with that 20-year pattern when I get back. Stick with us. See you after the break. All right, guys. Welcome back to Truth Hurts Radio. Again, this is your host, Charles Giuliani. Want to call in during the broadcast? Any comments, positive, negative, you name it? Dial in 512-904-8014. Again, that's 512-904-8014. Use it sparingly, but we do have a toll-free number, 866-841-1065. Okay, picking up where I left off. Notice what happens now. Lincoln refuses to take loans from these banking scum, for the Civil War. And, of course, he will not allow them to set up a central bank. He basically told them to take a hike. In fact, he did tell them to take a hike in no uncertain terms, quite graphically. Lincoln made a lot of speeches denouncing the bankers and their attempts to try to hijack this country through debt. So they pop him off. 20 years later, they're at it again. They're pushing again under Garfield. Garfield stands up and resists them. We all know what happened to Garfield, don't we? You see the pattern? 20 years again, folks, they're at it again, relentlessly. These guys don't give up. They start pushing under McKinley. McKinley stands up to resist them. Not only was he against central banking, but he was against the removal of tariffs, something that the globalists have wanted, all along. Get rid of tariffs, put the tax burden on the American taxpayer, to fund the government. The government used to subsist mostly on, there were excise taxes, but mostly on tariffs. Today, the tariffs are almost completely gone. The government subsists almost entirely on, I was going to say on the taxpayer, but indirectly on the taxpayer. It subsists on loans from the Federal Reserve that we pay back plus interest. Imagine that. What is the need for the middleman? What benefit does the middleman bring to us? Nothing. Nothing. It's just a parasite. Why does the government take loans from the central banks, then turn around and charge us to pay back those loans plus interest? Why? What function does it serve? Nothing except to be a parasite. That's it. That's all they exist for. The Federal Reserve exists to suck off the American people, and that's all it was intended to do from day one. Unbelievable. And the power that they exert, it's incredible. Those who saw the interview with Greenspan 2 years ago on PBS, McLaren was interviewing him. And he says, what kind of mechanism exists to hold the power of the Federal Reserve in check? Who is the Federal Reserve answerable to in Washington? Is it the president? Is it Congress? And Greenspan just smirks and says, the question's irrelevant. We don't answer to anybody. He actually said that, folks. Now, those of us who have studied the Federal Reserve already know this, but to hear such an admission like that, who can deny it now? Who can say, you're a crazy conspiracy theorist? Of course the Federal Reserve controls the federal government controls the Federal Reserve. No, it doesn't, folks. No, the Federal Reserve controls the federal government. It's the other way around. He says we don't answer to anyone. They do what they want. The most powerful financial institution in the country, and they're answerable to nobody. You, the taxpayer, have no power over them. Your so-called elected officials don't have any power over them either. It's unbelievable. Whoever runs a nation's economy runs that nation. Doesn't matter how powerful your military is. When it's a private banking monopoly that runs the nation's economy, the military itself is answerable to the money power. The money power supersedes the military. And that's where we're at, kids, like it or not. But don't expect to hear about this from Glenn Beck or Bill O'Reilly or Diane Sawyer, or any of these other talking heads, these little puppets in the mainstream media, or Professor X in your local college or university that gets multiplied millions of dollars in grant money from the government every year, hush money to shut them up. That's all that's about. They control the media. They control the education system. Oh, and yes, they control your church, too. They're all cults. If you don't like it, well, what can I say? The truth hurts. On future broadcasts, I'll be exposing that, too, what a fraud organized religion is, folks. You think they got the media under control? You think they have the education system under control? Any government knows that wants power, and all governments want power, don't they? Especially the governments of today. They're all in bed with each other working for a new world order. Any government knows that to control the people, it's not enough to control the media and the education system. You have to control the churches, because that's the one avenue people will turn to when the other systems fail them. That's the one that they tend to trust most, because they're speaking for God. And so you got to get control over them. And, oh, yes, our government took measures to do that a long time ago. Anyway, so now McKinley stands up just like Garfield and Lincoln and Jackson and Jefferson before him. He stands up to resist them. He won't allow tariff removals, and he won't allow a central bank that they're pushing for. So, boom, they pop him off. Just like Garfield and Lincoln before him, and the attempt on Jackson. Look at the pattern. It's unmistakable. You can't miss this. So now, they orchestrate a few years later, J.P. Morgan primarily, orchestrated the panic of 1907. This panic snuffed out several rival banks, like the Knickerbocker Bank, for example. And so it got rid of competition, setting the stage for this central banking system to emerge, the uncontested economic master of the country. But they pawned off this panic that they created as the reason for creating a central bank. See, if we had a central bank, we wouldn't have this panic. Here's your Hegelian dialectic, folks. Just like the bailout baloney. They create the debacle on Wall Street last September of last year, and then they come along and say, oh, we need to have a bailout now. Trillions of, well, first they said $750 billion. And then to fool people, they voted it down at first, and then later they regroup and voted in. And then they continued to raise the amount exponentially ever since. And the American people, as usual, are just snoozing away. And, as they get more stressed and burdened, as the cost of living goes up and their wages go down, or they lose their wages altogether because they're not working, they've been laid off, they'll just pop a few extra Prozac. Dear, can you hand me my Prozac bottle? It's so disgusting. So disgusting. We got a nation of zombies in this country. We really do. Millions, hundreds of millions of us are being sheep-herded by, maybe 4, 5, 6,000 at the most? The scum that are running the show in this country, it's probably about that, somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 people, on Wall Street, and running the big corporations and the primary stockholders of the Federal Reserve, most of which aren't even American, by the way. 65% of the primary stockholders of the Federal Reserve are foreign? Oh, America. I hate to say it, but I feel embarrassed. If I travel abroad, I feel embarrassed to even say I'm an American, because so many Americans are just plain stupid. But then again, in a different way, people in other countries are stupid. Look at Europe. Europe prides itself in being, better off than, or at least they did under Bush. They would say, oh, those dumb Americans to put up with that scoundrel, But Europe has been in a far worse, precarious position than we have for a long time now. They've had their European Union, and even before that, they had the EEC, the European Economic Community, which was the precursor to what we're seeing forming now, this political regionalization. The EEC was just a step toward that, just like NAFTA was a step toward what we're seeing coming now, the NAU, the North American Union, the equivalent of the European Union. People, you better wake up and see what's going on here. All of this stuff was foretold long ago. Zbigniew Brzezinski, for example, in his 1970 book, Between Two Ages, said that in order to bring about a world government, we have to bring nations together incrementally, regionally first, in small increments. We'll bring about world government. So we're going to create regional unions. At that time, you already had the early stages of the European Union, but you didn't have many of these others that you got now. Asia has their version. Africa has their version. And, some of them are military in nature. Some of them are political in nature. Some of them are economic in nature. But it doesn't matter. Just get nations used to cooperating regionally. NATO was an early stage of that. Get nations used to cooperating as alliances, military alliances. It doesn't matter. Whatever the pretext, just get them used to cooperating, and then later we'll bring them all together under one global banner. All right, folks, short break. I'll pick up from there when we get back. Stick with us. All right, guys. Back to Hertz Radio. Now entering into the second hour. And we're getting into the heart of our discussion here, coming up into more modern times, working our way up into the 20th century. This is where things really whipped into high gear now. Just to recap briefly, all during the 19th century, the banking scum were busy working behind the scenes, trying to set up their little central bank, their little octopus with which to choke us to death. They couldn't do it, though. It never really worked. They had some progress that they had made from time to time, but then, take a few steps and then fall 10 back, take a few more, fall back. It wasn't until the 20th century that things finally whipped into high gear. And this is where it gets really scary. 1913 was the beginning of the end for this country. And when I say end, it doesn't have to end. It doesn't need to go the way they want it to. It's still not too late, even at this stage, to turn things around. We could do it, folks. We have them far outnumbered, and we could easily outwit them. If you could just get people on the same page, we could easily outwit them. It's been done in the past. A national strike, for example, would shut them down. It would shut the government down. It would shut the corporations that run the government down. The whole system would come to a grinding halt. We'd have them at our mercy. They would know it. There's nothing they could do. We talk about how advanced our society is today with all our technological developments, but the truth is, 150 years ago, we were in a much better position than we are today. Oh, sure, we didn't have flushable toilets and electric razors and, lamps that you can just turn on without pouring kerosene into them and, blah, blah, blah. We didn't have computers and cars and radios and TVs. But guess what? People were self-sufficient back then, weren't they? They couldn't control people back then like they do now. So have we really made advancements? Have these technological advancements really been a blessing to us or a curse? Everybody's locked into the grid now. Nobody knows how to, plant a garden anymore to subsist off their own land. No, all people know how to do is drive to the grocery store and pick up some produce and, a couple pounds of beef or something, flip some burgers on the grill. People don't know how to dig a well and get their own water right from their own backyard, It's disgusting. People don't know how to chop a tree down and build a fire, to heat their home in the winter. No, everybody's locked in. You got to pay the oil man, the gas man, the electric company. We're locked in. They have us totally under their control. Everything now is centrally controlled. So we're not in a better situation today than we were. They couldn't get away with the New World Order, folks, so easily 100, 150 years ago. Even with a fully fledged central bank in the 19th century, there was still a lot of bartering that went on. People didn't have to depend on the dollar, the way they got you now. There's no bartering system anymore. Everything is all the almighty worthless Federal Reserve banknotes, the fraudulent interest-bearing currency that we've been sucked into accepting. All right, folks, another short break. Stick with us. We'll be right back. All right, you little peasants. Everybody just relax now. Accept your leaders and their leadership. Shut up, do what you are told, and everybody will be happy. At least everybody on the Wall Street anyways. And if you're not, too bad for you, but shut up anyways if we put a bullet to your head. Guys, they want absolute totalitarian power on a grand scale. How can people not see this? I mean, come on. This has been the case all through human history. You give leaders enough space, and they're going to take you for a ride, baby. They want absolute power. That's all there is to it. Not just our leaders, but the ones that pulled the strings behind the curtain, the ones that controlled them. Big money. Big money in bed with big government. It's always been the case. That was the case in the Roman Empire. That was the case under Stalin. It's always been the case. Big money, even though the word fascism is a more relatively recent coined phrase, the principle behind it goes way, way back. Big money and big government in bed with each other, scratching each other's backs at the expense of everybody else. Here we go again. All you got to do is just sucker people, put them into a false sense of security, get them to relax and trust you, and that's it. It's over. And that's where we're at. For the most part, people, don't question anything. They just let these guys do whatever they want. Oh, I did my part. I went to the ballot box. I voted my man in. Now I can just sit back and relax. Oh, give me a break. Yeah, you voted your puppet in, if you even did that. Well, this election, they didn't have to rig it in the sense of, choosing their candidate they wanted through the Diebold machines or through the Supreme Court like they did the previous two elections. They didn't have to rig it that way. It was already rigged in the sense that both candidates were handpicked. See, that's the amazing thing. They don't have to rig it. They only rigged it for Bush to win because he was the one that they knew they could get their agenda through a lot easier than under a liberal. But now they also realize, okay, we people are fed up with the Republicans, so we'll give them a Democrat now. But it's still a hand-picked puppet of theirs. I mean, you can't get more globalist than Obama. He told you exactly where he was coming from. In July of last year, he spoke in Berlin, and he talked about global citizenship. He said, global citizenship is not a choice. It is the one way, the only way to our common humanity and security. He told you exactly who he was right there. And yet, just like a Hitler rally, everybody was cheering him on. He just got done telling them, we're going to continue to sell you out to the world global, system, world citizenship, global citizenship. What do you think that is? It's world government. And they're all cheering him. They might as well have said, hail the Fuhrer, And then he went on to say that Europeans and Americans alike are going to be required to do more, not less, toward the furtherance of this goal. They're going to take more of your money, send more of your kids to fight their phony imperialistic wars. And then he said, as if that all wasn't enough, he said, a change in the leadership in Washington will not mean a change in the pursuance of this goal. In other words, it doesn't matter who you vote for, me or McCain. Both of us are going to push for this same goal, world government. Can you believe it? You give these guys enough space, folks, they will tell you what they're doing. Just like Brzezinski in his 97 book, The Grand Chessboard, page 211, he talked about how in the coming years we're going to need to go into Eurasia, i.e. Afghanistan, and seize the oil reserves and natural gas in the Caspian Sea. We need to build a pipeline across that region. And to do this, to get the American public behind us in support of this agenda, we need to have a massive, widely perceived direct external threat. There's your 9/11. They tell you in advance what they're going to do. And then when they do it and you point these things out, oh, you're crazy, you're paranoid. There it is, right in black and white. Look at Rockefeller in his 2002 book, Memoirs. He said, there's those who accuse me and my family of conspiring with others around the world to destroy American sovereignty and to merge us into a world system of government. To those who make such charges, I plead guilty and I'm proud of it. Can you believe it? One of the top elitists in this country admitting proudly that, yeah, I am behind, me and my family have been behind this New World Order thing. They admit it, they boast about it, and yet you point it out and people still say, oh, you're crazy, you're paranoid. It's unbelievable. We're in the twilight zone. Anyway, let's get back to the early 20th century now and, get this fresh perspective on history. I used to hate history in high school, and if somebody told me back then that I was going to become a history major one day, I would have told them they were crazy. I absolutely hated history. It was the most boring thing in all my school experience. I just hated it. Of course, it didn't help that I had a boring, monotone-voiced history teacher, but it wouldn't matter anyway because the history they teach you was garbage. It's poppycock. It's only when you really understand history, now it becomes interesting, now it comes to life, when you know the hidden agenda working behind the scenes. And so once you get this perspective, once you see history for what it is, especially the past 100 years, where so much has gone on, now it takes on a whole new meaning, and it does become absolutely fascinating in a pathetic sort of way, but, you can make sense of it now and understand why we're in the mess we're in. So they knock off McKinley. They orchestrate the 1907 panic to bring about, to create the illusion in the public mind of a need for a central bank. And so now they're not going to wait 20 years. They just popped off McKinley a few years earlier. They're not going to wait 20 years now for the next attempt at a central bank. They got too many things planned here, and they got to push this thing forward as quick as they can. They need to get a central bank here rapidly because they're busy planning World War. And in order to get their World War, they need to get the U.S. involved in it, but to get the U.S. involved, they got to have a means to pay back the huge debts that this war will accrue. So they need to get this central bank in place. And they need to get an income tax, graduating income tax in place, so they can tax the public to pay for these loans that they're going to suck them into taking, or have the government be suckered into taking in their name. Right out of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, folks, they needed to get a central bank and a graduating income tax. And lo and behold, that's exactly what they did. When you read books like Philip Drew, Administrator, written by Colonel Edward Mandell House, he wasn't a colonel, it was just an honorary title that was given to him. He was one of the chief, in fact, the chief advisor to Woodrow Wilson, the globalist hand-picked puppet. They realized in order to get our central bank and our income tax and whatnot in place, we need to put one of our insider boys in power. And it's been that way ever since. No president now since Wilson has, really been for this country's interests. Well, one president was, they killed him, Kennedy, of course. But that's it. Every other president has been a sellout. In fact, they thought Kennedy was. At first he was a club member, but later he developed a conscience and decided to try to turn things around in favor of the American people for a change, and that's why he had to go. But every other president has been a complete sellout. And, there was one other exception, actually. There was Warren Harding, and they killed him. He's not listed as one of the assassinated presidents, but he was. They poisoned him. And then his physician said it was an embolism without even doing an autopsy, and then they buried him before there ever was one. That was a murder. He was against central banking and, the Federal Reserve and against tariff removals. All right, guys, another break. Stick with us. We'll be right back. All right, guys. Welcome back to Truth Hertz Radio. I was talking just before the break. I was talking about Philip Drew, a book written by Woodrow Wilson's top advisor, Edward Mandell House. He wrote this novel back in, I think it was 1910, 2 years before Wilson was even voted into office. And in the book, under the guise of a fictitious novel, he admitted, by the way, later in 1925 during an interview, that the book was written about what he knew was going to be happening in coming years. The book describes this middleman, this goer between Washington and Wall Street. He would carry orders from Wall Street to Washington to the president. It was a book written about himself, who would later become this middleman between Jacob Schiff and Woodrow Wilson. Anyway, in the book he describes how the goal of this middleman, i.e. himself, was to create socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, to create socialism in the United States. And specifically, the two main goals that were to be accomplished to bring socialism about was to create a central bank and a graduating income tax. Absolutely incredible. That's exactly what happened under Wilson. The same year, 1913. Early in the year 1913, they created the 16th Amendment, the alleged justification for the income tax, the legalization of it. It wasn't. The law wasn't even properly ratified, or the amendment, I should say. And even if it was, it doesn't matter because it didn't repeal previous amendments which don't allow direct taxation of an American citizen, especially on his wages, his earnings. And, the Supreme Court even affirmed and reaffirmed that the 16th Amendment didn't change anything. Even if it was properly ratified, it didn't change anything. If you read it, it doesn't give any new powers of taxation. It's a fraud, folks. But yet they still claim that that justifies the income tax. No, it doesn't. It's totally illegal. Anyway, later that year, in fact, in late December, while most of Congress was away for Christmas break, that's when they sleazily ramrodded the Federal Reserve Act through. Wilson signed it without Congress even being there. And so there you have it. The very next month, January of 1914, World War I breaks out. And that was all planned. We know that, for example, from the documents produced by the Reese Committee. In 1953, a congressional committee was put together to investigate the foundations, the Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie et al. Foundations, because a lot of complaints were being made about the inordinate influences they were exerting in Washington. So this committee was put together to look into the foundations to see exactly what was going on, what they were up to, and sure enough, they found out that they were exerting a tremendous, not only was the influence inordinate, but it was an unhealthy influence. It was, they were gearing us away from the Constitution and working to destroy our sovereignty and merge us with a world government. That was the conclusion of the Reese Committee. Oh, there's a lot more honest people in Congress back in those days. And headed up by Senator Dodd. He was amazed at some of the stuff that they uncovered. One of the things was the meeting minutes from a 1909 Carnegie Institute for International Peace. What a misnomer that is. But in these meeting minutes, they discovered that when the elites had met at the Carnegie Institute, they discussed plans for an upcoming world war. And their biggest concern was how to involve the United States in this war. That was their biggest concern, because to create this war, they needed, for it to be global, they needed to get the United States involved. They not only wanted this war to make big profits, but they wanted it, so they could exploit it as a means to help bring about world government. Because, of course, after that war, we got the Versailles Treaty, which has been credited to Woodrow Wilson, but of course it was his handlers, his little puppeteers behind the curtain that drafted that whole fiasco up. As part of the Versailles Treaty, they created the League of Nations. The League of Nations was to be the catalyst for world government. After the war, everybody was desperate. They wanted to see an end to such wars like this. They didn't want to see another war like this again. And so the elite said, oh, no problem. Oh, we can set that up for you. We can make sure nothing like this ever happens again. We created this League of Nations so that nations now can meet at the bargaining table instead of the battlefield to work out their differences. It was a means, again, your Hegelian dialectic. Bring the nations to desperation so they'd be willing to accept your fraudulent system that really was a cloaked early-stage setup for world government. It didn't work, though, and they anticipated that it probably wouldn't, that the United States, being so isolationist at the time, against interventionist, probably wouldn't accept it, and that is exactly what happened. So they anticipated this and had a backup plan, that if the League of Nations ultimately failed, they were going to create another world war, after which time they'd create another system like the League of Nations with a different name, and that's exactly what they did, the United Nations. This time they put its headquarters on America's front doorstep, figuring, they won't be suspicious now, it's right there, on their own property. It worked. They got their Second World War, made big fat wads of cash, brought the nations to even greater levels of desperation, and so now they were all willing, including the United States, to accept their catalyst for world government, the United Nations. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's jump back here to World War I. How to get the U.S. involved. The U.S. was totally isolationist. How can we get them involved in this war? We have the central bank and the income tax to provide the funding, and to suck off of the public, but how do we get them involved in the war itself? Oh, that was the tricky part. And this is what they did. The first and most major step was to send Lend-Lease. The United States, don't forget, initially, in fact, for most of that war, was neutral, or at least claiming to be neutral. But yet, all the while, Lend-Lease was being sent over to England and France to help fight against Germany. You know, we were sending munitions stored in the hulls of passenger and merchant vessels, the most famous of which, of course, was the Lusitania. Many of you, I'm sure, know this story, but for those who don't, let me just briefly sum up what went on. Our government, knowing full well that German U-boats were going to target this ship, stocked the hull with munitions, and the passengers were assured that everything's safe, even though the German government, now listen to this, the German government had more compassion for innocent American and British lives being lost than our own government and the British government. The German government sent mercenaries to the dock there in New York. They actually took ads out, too, posted ads in New York papers warning passengers not to board the Lusitania, because it was, in fact, loaded with munitions, and that it might possibly or most likely be a target for a German U-boat and be sunk. Well, our government had their little thugs there counteracting the warning of the Germans. They said, oh, don't listen to this, it's just war propaganda, don't worry, you're perfectly safe, blah, 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 blah. They wanted those people to die. 1,100-plus people died on that ship when it was torpedoed. The United States government wanted these innocent people to die so they could capitalize on that as an excuse to get into the war. It didn't work right away. It took a lot of propaganda in the media, but ultimately that's what got us into the war, folks, along with the Zimmerman Telegraph. Talk about that some more when we get back, folks. Stick with us. All right, guys. Welcome back to Truth Hurts Radio. It's your host, Charles Giuliani. So this is how they got us into World War I. They lied. They said that... the U.S. government said that they were neutral, while yet sending Lend-Lease over to England and France, setting up the Lusitania and similar ships to be sunk. Didn't care how many innocent people died. In fact, the more the better, because it would give the shock value. This is why, once you come up to 9/11, I mean, it's a given. When you understand the history of these phony charades that the government has perpetrated over the years, causing the death of tens or even hundreds of thousands, sending them to fight phony wars and setting up phony crises to get us into the wars in the first place. 9/11, it's a given, folks. 9/11 is just one link in a long chain of events like this. The only thing different about 9/11 is, they did it right here on our soil, and, it was a record amount of deaths all at once. That's the only difference, but it's the same M.O., modus operandi, it's the same old story over and over and over again, and that people don't see it is just absolutely mind-boggling, because this has been their tactic all along. All along. It's like missing the forest for the trees, How can you miss it? Look it, open your eyes, smack, smack. Get the Prozac out of your bloodstream and snap out of it. Smarten up. So anyway, look what happens now. They get the Versailles Treaty, and they set up the League of Nations. As part of another part of the Versailles Treaty, they made Germany responsible. They set the whole thing up, but, they made the blame fall on Germany. And so they crippled Germany with these horribly oppressive reparation payments. This was designed so that if need be, well, not only to make a lot of money off of Germany and to keep them in check, because Germany was a major economic power at the time, and major, industrial power. And they didn't want that. They didn't want too much power falling in the hands of Germany. So by giving them these oppressive reparation payments, it was curtailing their economic growth, number one, but also setting the stage for a possible Second World War if the League of Nations failed. And that, of course, is just what happened. Most people don't realize this, but all during the 20s, Germany's economy was faltering big time. If it looked like they were able to make their payments, they would just raise the interest rates. They would tweak it until Germany got to the point where, they were defaulting now, that they couldn't make the payments. The Versailles Treaty was crippling them. the reparation payments was too great of a burden for them. But to ensure that they were utterly crippled and had their hands completely tied, as time went on, and sure enough, they were defaulting, the bankers came along and offered them some deals, like the Dawes plan and the Young plan. You know, if you're hurting economically, the last thing you want is for a banker to come along and offer you a deal. I mean, you got to be kidding me. Bankers don't exist to make your burden easy. Bankers exist to fatten their wallets and suck off of you. And you know what? Common sense will tell you, if you're in debt, taking out loans is not going to help your debt problem, is it now? It's like, you know, you just got laid off, you don't have any money coming in, but yet you have a couple credit cards. So what do? Well, I don't want to lose my purchasing power. I still want to take the wife out to eat, and I still want to buy that tool set. So you go out and you charge. It looks good. Your neighbors look at you and say, wow, I don't know how that guy does it. Look at, he's buying all these things and still taking his wife out to eat. How is he doing it? He's doing it because he's living off of credit and pushing himself deeper into a crisis situation. That's what Germany was doing. You don't think the German government knew this? Of course they did, but they didn't care. They were just trying to stave off a collapse so that, you know, it wouldn't happen under their watch. We'll worry about it when the next guy comes in office, you know. So this is what they were doing. They kept taking loans. The loans created the illusion that the economy was booming, because once that money was thrown out into the economy, yeah, everything looked great and the people were happy, but it was all a charade. That's how our economy works, by the way. You know, every time we get into a slump because the debt is catching up with us, they stage a war. You know, a thing like 9/11. 9/11 had many purposes it served, but one was to generate big fat profits for the Pentagon contracting companies and to create the illusion that the economy is booming once again. And that's what they'll do. They'll point the increases in the Dow as proof that the economy is picking up. That doesn't prove anything. It proves that some certain big companies that are favored by Washington and get unbidded contracts, for example, are doing well. But, you know, you can easily toy with the stock market, and they do. That's all it is. It's just a game. All you have to do is lay a bunch of people off and relocate your base of operation to India and China. Many of the big Fortune 500s are doing that, right? That can make your stocks go way up and look like things are picking up. But in reality, the economy is a shambles. It's in a shambles. People are getting laid off by the millions. That's what indicates a solid economy is employment, you know, people having jobs. But no, they lie to you. They play the little numbers game. So, you know, our economy is in the same mess that the Weimar government was in Germany in the 1920s and early 30s. So anyway, look what they do. They sink Germany further and further into debt. It looks good, you know, initially. The loans seem to be picking things up, but ultimately, of course, it gets them in more trouble. Did you know that at the end of World War I, the German mark was actually equal in trade value with the British pound? Even though the ravages of war had crippled their economy to some degree, their industrial base was so strong that it didn't really affect the value of their currency. It was still equal in trade value with the British pound. But by the end of the 1920s, things had gotten so bad because of the Versailles Treaty, you know, the reparation payments and then the Dawes plan and the Young plan and all the tweaking of the interest rates. This was all by design. The German mark had sunk to 1/20 billionth that of the English pound. You heard correctly. It sunk to 1/20 billionth that of the English pound. It was so bad that wives were running to their husband's place of work every hour on the hour to collect their little meager pay. They would pay them every hour because, you know, the value of the mark was dropping so far by the hour that, you know, they were paying them on the hour so the wives could quickly run to the grocery store and buy whatever little vigils their meager husband's pay could afford. Because, you know, it could drop another 20,000 points, you know, in the next hour. This was bad, folks. There were roughly 800,000 people that starved to death during this period. And these were working class people. These were people that had jobs, but their income wasn't enough to feed them and their families. 800,000 Germans, almost 1 million Germans died from starvation, all because of this little rigged economic game that was going on at the hand of the banksters that brought us World War I, that brought us the Federal Reserve and all the other central banks across Europe, that created the Versailles Treaty, and on and on and on. They did this to Germany to drive them to a situation of desperation so that they could get their next war on, and that's exactly what they did. When Hitler stepped onto the scene, and of course he was all, hand-selected by them, he was just the nut job that they wanted to get another war going. He was also, though, the nut job that the German people wanted, because he promised to renounce the Versailles Treaty and its reparation payments, and he did. So the German people, initially anyway, loved him. Yeah, he got us out of debt to the Versailles Treaty. Okay, and so the German economy picked up. Hitler, it was booming, in fact. Hitler built the Autobahns, he developed the Volkswagen, The German economy was back on track. No more debt. Everybody seemed happy. But they didn't realize that he was building up the German economy so that he could build a strong war machine and set off a global, the Second World War. And he did. So he was the man that the German people wanted, but unfortunately he was also the man that the banksters wanted. As always, the German people were duped again. They thought they were getting a life preserver, and instead they got a lead weight. But the bankers, once again, couldn't have been more happy because they got their catalyst for world government after World War II. Not only did they make big fat wads of cash, once again, through the contracting, military contracting, but even more importantly, they got the United Nations. The $8 million check donated by John D. Rockefeller Jr. Unbelievable. Out of the goodness of his heart, he wanted to establish this wholesome and wonderful humanitarian organization. Yeah, whatever. All right, guys, short break. Stick with us. Be right back.
Okay, welcome back to Truthers Radio. This is Henry Kissinger. I've taken over the show. I just wanted to say thank you, you good little suckers, for helping us create New World Order, keeping your mouth shut and being good little worker bees for us.
All right, guys, just got another short few minutes here left of the show. Just to sum up, you all know the story about Pearl Harbor, how to sucker us into yet another war. Did you know that good old FDR, I mentioned briefly before what a great servant he was to the international banking cartel. This man is hailed as one of the all-time greatest presidents. In fact, some history books claim that he's the greatest president in American history. He was one of the worst. In fact, until Georgie Boy came along a few years ago, he was the worst, if you ask me. He did more in service to the bankers than probably any other president or all other presidents combined, except for Georgie Boy, of course. Georgie Boy has beaten all records. But stick around, Obama might even beat that record. But FDR was a scoundrel. He conducted the biggest gold heist in all of recorded human history, handed it right over to the very bankers that got us into the economic slump that we were in the first place, the 29 crash and the ensuing Great Depression. It required Americans to hand over all their privately owned gold to stabilize the currency. And that bank was simply funneled over into private accounts in Swiss banks, the accounts of the Federal Reserve primary stockholders. Didn't stabilize the currency. They simply stole it and sent it overseas. It's unbelievable. And then, and by the way, if you didn't comply with that, you were faced with either a $10,000 fine and or a 10-year prison sentence. Well, there's no tally on it. Who knows? There's no way to tell how much gold they stole from us, but you can bet it was an exorbitant amount of gold. And then, nobody complained at first because, after all, they were going to pay you. Yeah, worthless green pieces of paper. Nevertheless, they paid people, what the value of the gold was in Federal Reserve notes. But then they turned around. FDR turned around on behalf of his bankster buddies and devaluated that same currency by 59% less than a year later. Can you believe this? Unflippin' believable. But anyway, we all know the story. FDR was, they set up the Pearl Harbor thing. But prior to that, they were trying to do the same thing to Germany that Wilson had done 20 or so years earlier. They were sending Lend-Lease once again. While claiming to be neutral in the war, they were sending Lend-Lease to England and France, to fight against Germany. Hitler, of course, saw this, but he didn't act on it because he didn't want a repeat of what happened in World War I. He knew what the U.S. was doing. And he wanted to try to keep the U.S. out of the war, at least for as long as he could, because he had all he could do to handle the eastern and western fronts already that he was dealing with, France and England on one side and Russia on the other. So he didn't take the bait. And when he didn't, they decided to turn to the Pacific instead. Whatever it takes, we've got to get into this war. So what did they do? They started sending Lend-Lease to China to fight against Japan. And then, the ultimate insult, they imposed an embargo on Japan, and that was the final straw. That ticked off the Japanese, so they made plans to attack Pearl Harbor, and of course, they had already had the Purple Code cracked, so they just monitored their communications, and when they realized, okay, they're going to hit Pearl Harbor on December 7th, we'll just sit back and let it happen, and then we'll have the notice of warning sent to them an hour later when it's too late to make it look like, oh, we were on top of this, but not soon enough, not quick enough. What a crock. So they sent another, 1,100 plus people to their deaths then, just like with the Lusitania. And that got us into the war. When you see this pattern repeating itself over and over and over again, we were doing this back in the 19th century with the when we annexed from Mexico, California, and New Mexico, and Arizona, and Atoll. We set the Mexicans up for that, too. You can go to the Vietnam War. That was all a setup, as was the Korean War. In fact, every Cold War fiasco was just that, a fiasco. None of them were legitimate, folks. Absolutely none of them. None of them were legal. Every war that this country has been involved in since World War II has been illegal. Not one of them had the constitutionally required congressional declaration of war, but yet they managed to sucker this country into over 60 conflicts during World War II. The same holds true for the current two wars that we're suckered into in the wake of 9/11, the Iraq and the Afghan wars. There was no congressional declaration of war for those conflicts either, and yet there we are. The whopping bulk of our national debt has come from these phony wars via the Pentagon. And yet none of these wars have been legitimate. It's all about global conquest en route to, the New World Order. That's all this is about. They're using the United States, fighting under the auspice of the UN, of course. That's been the case since World War II. Every conflict we've been involved in. It's a little partnership deal. We go in, we do the conquering, so we look bad. But then the UN comes in and occupies the country that we just conquered with UN peacekeeping forces, i.e., occupation forces. Of course, the U.S. will set up their bases there as well to help assist the UN in keeping the new minion of the empire compliant. If we don't outright bomb a country, other tactics that we used, continue to use, have been, economic briberies under the guise of economic aid. We just pay off a corrupt leader to sell his population out to the interest of big money and big, world government. It's buy-off money is all it is. And all the while, they're draining our coffers dry. You talk about taxation without representation, folks. When they send all of these billions, yea, trillions of dollars overseas every year, money that is not accountable, they don't give account as to how it's being spent. They give it to these foreign leaders to use as they will. Look how much we send to Israel every year. They use a lot of that money to murder Palestinians, bulldoze their homes, engage in fake terrorist attacks that they blame the Palestinians for when it's a Mossad agent or group of Mossad agents doing it. That's all paid for by our tax dollars. Oh, I'm telling you. When you think of the American Revolution, much of that was staged also, but nevertheless, most of the participants was sincere and had a true desire to liberate, and for a time did liberate, at least for white people anyway. It was never a reality for minority groups in this country for the most part, but when you realize that this country started over a protest against a tax that was not direct. It was not imposed. It was a voluntary tax. If you didn't want to pay the tea tax, you didn't buy the tea, that's all. But it only amounted to between 1% and 3% of your wages, depending how much tea you drank. It was an insignificant amount of money. It was more the principle of the thing that they were protesting. And yeah, there was other issues involved. It was the British East India Company, competition thing. It was a monopoly that they were creating. That tax wasn't imposed on that tea. It was only the domestic importers. So it was really designed to crush out competition domestically so that the British East India Company could have a monopoly on tea imports. Most of the parliament was invested in that company, so it served their interests to pass this tea law, this tax law. But anyway, my point is, look at how America stood up against that tax when it really wasn't a big deal. It was just the principle of it. But look at the outrageous tax burden we have today, what a fraud it is, how illegal it is, and how this money is being used antithetically to our interests. The money isn't even being spent that is even remotely in our interest. It's all antithetical to our interest. This money being spent is used to buy off phony foreign dictators that we put in power to keep them compliant. It's being used to fund our fraudulent military that invades countries for phony reasons that they tell us is about spreading freedom and democracy, but it's really about raping and pillaging these foreign countries and turning them into compliant minions of the global expanding empire. I mean, look at what they're doing to us. Do you realize your combined federal, state, and local tax burden now amounts to over 50% of your wages? 50% of your income, over 50%, goes to el governmente. And yet, where's the outrage? People aren't complaining. Where's the spirit of 1776 in this country anymore? In fact, even when people are ignorant and you tell them, for the most part, if they even believe you, in spite of all the evidence, a lot of them don't even believe you anyway. They'll call you crazy and walk away. But even if they believe you, you can't get them off their heinies to do anything about it. Time to wake up, America. Anyway, folks, that's it for this show. Another interesting topic we'll be covering next week. Don't miss it. Until then, have a great week. We'll see you next week. Take care.